cool to talk right here because we actually shot a lot of 21 right across the street at the World Trade Center of Boston, which is right across from this hotel. And I think we turned it into the McCarran Airport of Vegas. And there's a lot of scenes in the movie where they're outside of McCarran Airport or in a parking garage. And we actually shot that in the dead of winter in Boston. It was negative 10 degrees. And there kept being smoke coming out of their mouth from the cold. So the director had the idea that they would all put ice in their mouth. And so they were in shorts and t-shirts with ice in their mouth trying to act out these scenes. But it didn't work, and the smoke still came out, so they ended up CGIing. That was pretty much the only CGI in that movie, was getting rid of smoke. But it's awesome to be here. And, you know, as he described, Mark Zuckerberg has called me the Jackie Collins of Silicon Valley. I never set out to be that. I never set out to be a nonfiction writer at all. I always hated nonfiction when I was growing up. And I wanted to be a writer, but I loved really bad television, like Saved by the Bell, and you know, used to watch every episode of Three's Company. And I was kind of a trashy kind of TV guy. And my dad set a rule when I was young that I had to read 2 books a week before I was allowed to watch TV to try and keep me from watching so much TV. And then I became a speed reader, and that didn't help, and I ended up watching even more TV. But when I graduated from college, I decided I want to be a writer. So I locked myself in a room in Boston, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and I wrote 9 novels. And I was writing a lot of really bad stuff. It was all deep, dark stories that took place in bars in New York City, because I was reading Bret Easton Ellis and Jay McInerney, and I thought that's what writers write. So I wrote these books, and I would send them out and get rejected, and I ended up getting 190 rejection slips. Had them taped to all my walls. I was rejected by pretty much everyone in New York City. I was even rejected by a janitor at a publishing house because I sent a manuscript to an editor who was no longer working there, and it got thrown in the trash, and the janitor took it out of the trash and read it and then rejected me. So you can see how well I was writing at the time. But eventually I caught the eye of an editor who said, you know, I'm not going to publish any of the crap you're writing, but why don't you go read John Grisham and come back in a year? So I went and I read John Grisham, and I read Michael Crichton, and I read, you know, Robert Ludlum and all these thriller writers, and I thought, okay, I'll write a thriller. And my dad's a doctor, and this was the dawn of ER. ER was really hot. So I decided I'll write a medical thriller. So I wrote, my first book was called Threshold. Don't worry, none of you have ever heard of it. It was about an evil scientist who was implanting people with genetic diseases. It was really trashy. And I got it published, and I was really excited, and I thought, oh, now I'm a writer. And I thought it would all be glamorous and exciting. And I remember my first stop on my first book tour was something called Tunnel Radio, which is a radio station that only airs in 100 yards in the Callahan Tunnel in Boston. So it's literally a traffic station that some producer got the idea of having authors on. Of course, nobody wants to hear you on tunnel radio, because if they turned it on, they're trying to get to the airport. So that was my first stop, but that got me a second book deal, which was called Reaper. None of you have ever heard of that either. And it was about a computer virus that makes the jump to the biological world, and people start getting sick from their television sets. And I came up with this idea after a really bad episode of Oprah. Basically, it was really trashy, but it caught the attention of Hollywood, and it was made into a TV movie called Fatal Error, which still airs at 2 in the morning on the Sci-Fi Channel. But please, if you see it, turn it off. It's so bad. It stars Antonio Sabato Jr., the underwear model, if you remember him. He plays a surgeon, which is very believable casting. I guess surgeons do a whole lot of crunches because the guy was really built. I think Robert Wagner was the bad guy. And I remember I kind of learned my first rule of Hollywood on the set of that TV movie, which is that the writer ranks just below the caterer in terms of importance. I couldn't even get into the wrap party because they didn't know who I was, and I had to go in as Antonio Sabato Jr.'s buddy. I remember watching the movie with my dad, who I said is a doctor, and there's this scene where Antonio Sabato Jr. is leaning over this patient's chest, and he's like, "We've got a subdural hematoma." And my dad turns to me and goes, "You know that's in the head, right?" But I had no control over that. And after that, I ended up getting a deal with the X-Files television show, if you remember that show. Great show. They called me up and asked if I wanted to move to LA and write for them. But I don't drive, so moving to LA wasn't really an option for me. I'm just a Boston kid. So I basically said I'll write a book starring Mulder and Scully. So I wrote a book called Skin, which again, none of you have ever heard of unless you're obsessed X-Files fans. And it was about a skin transplant gone bad, where this professor gets a skin transplant from a murderer and then starts killing people. And you can see the beautiful stuff I was writing. It was real literary. And Mulder and Scully have to investigate this skin transplant. And they go to Thailand, where I had never been. And I used a Fyodor's guidebook to write the whole book. And I learned another rule of Hollywood, which is that obsessed fans can be crazy. I still get calls to this day from people asking where Mulder is. And I can have to explain that he's not a real person, that it's a television character. But that was where I was in my career. And I was writing this trashy pop fiction that nobody was reading. But I used to hang out in a bar in Boston called Crossroads. Some of you might have gone to MIT. It's like an MIT dive bar, if you can picture what that would look like. And there was a group of these MIT kids that sat in one corner, and they looked like your regular math science guys. Most of them were Asian. They were really nice kids. But what was weird was they had tons of money, and it was all in $100 bills. And in Boston, you never see $100 bills. I mean, I don't know where you all live. In New York, you see them sometimes. In Vegas, they come out of the ATM machines. But in Boston, you never see $100 bills. So I went over to this kid, and I was like, why do you have so much money? And he invited me to his house. And he points to his laundry. And stacked above his laundry was $250,000 in $100 bills, all in banded stacks of hundreds. So I thought, this is pretty cool. And I thought, well, maybe he's a drug dealer, but he didn't look like a drug dealer. I mean, he was a real geeky guy. So I was like, why do you have so much money? And he's like, well, come to Vegas with me tomorrow. So I was at a point in my life where I could do that. So the next day I got on a plane with him, and 5 of his buddies from MIT got on the plane, but they all pretended like they didn't know each other. And we flew to Vegas, and when we got there was a limousine waiting, and there was a uniformed driver, and he walked up and asked for Kevin Lewis. That was the name I gave this kid in my book, because at the time he didn't want anyone to think of him as the blackjack guy. Of course, when the movie came out, he wanted everyone to think of him as the blackjack guy, so his name was Jeff in real life. But the guy asked for Kevin Lewis, and we go to this suite on the Strip, and it was one of those huge suites with like glass walls, and we had a swimming pool, and there was 2 butlers. We didn't even know what to do with one butler, but we had 2 butlers, and all the MIT kids start coming into the room and pulling money out from under their clothes, and they pile it up on a table in the middle of the room, and it was $1 million in cash. And they said, we're the MIT blackjack team. And I had heard of something called the MIT blackjack team, but I thought it was like a math class at MIT where they learn how to play blackjack. The reality was, this had been going on at MIT for about 25 years. These secrets of blackjack had been passed down from group of students to group of students, along with a bankroll of about $1 million, and each group kind of improved on it. And this group of 6 kids had won between $5 and $7 million playing blackjack. And I was blown away, because I was writing all this trash, and here was this real story going on that was way better than all of the fiction I was writing. So I convinced them to let me kind of join the team for a while and hang out with them, and that was my book, Bringing Down the House. And a lot of you saw the movie 21, a lot of you kind of know the book, but it's a really fun story. The idea is that blackjack is a beatable game, because blackjack, unlike other games in the casino, has a memory, which is essentially that every card that comes out of a blackjack deck is no longer in the deck. So the deck changes as you play. This is different than, say, roulette, where it doesn't matter if you spin red 10 times in a row. That doesn't change your odds of spinning red, even though everyone kind of thinks it does, but it really doesn't. Blackjack, if all the aces come out of the deck, you're not going to get blackjack. So there actually does come a moment in blackjack where you have an advantage. If you're watching the cards and you see all of the low cards come out, which means there's more high cards in the deck, you have an advantage, because the dealer's going to bust more often and you're going to hit blackjack more often. And that's all that card counting is. You watch the cards, you keep track of the low cards. When more low cards come out, you raise your bet, you win more money. The problem with this is that Vegas frowns upon it. They don't want you to do it. And they're not going to drag you into a back room and put rings on their finger and beat you up anymore. But they will kick you out, and they will do things that are kind of bad. So what the MIT team did was they used team method, where you send 6 to 10 college kids into the casino, 1 kid sitting at each table, and he's the guy keeping track of the cards. And he looks like a regular, guy in Vegas. And he keeps track of the cards. When the cards get good, he signals in the guy called the big player. and that's the guy acting like the rich, drunk high roller. He gives them a signal. In the movie, it was always Kate Bosworth going like this, but that was because they liked to show Kate Bosworth going like this. But the signals were a little bit more complex than that. You'd signal in the big player. He sits down. He bets $10,000 a hand, or whatever the player limit is, only on a good deck. He gets the signal it's no longer good, and he keeps on walking. So in this way, you're only betting big money on good hands. You actually get about a 2% advantage over the house doing this, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're betting $10,000 a hand, it ends up being a whole lot of money. 2% is basically what the casino's advantage is in blackjack over normal players. So the MIT team used this method, and they would also use the casino stereotypes against them. The casino has an idea of what a high roller looks like. If a white guy with glasses from Boston walks into a casino with $1 million in his hands, it doesn't look right, because I'm not what a high roller in Vegas looks like. But if an Asian guy or a Persian guy walks into a casino with $1 million in cash, that looks normal, because that's what most high rollers look like. So the MIT team would recruit as many Asians and Persians as they could. If you've been to MIT, you know that wasn't that difficult for them, because the majority of the class was Asian and Persian. It also turns out that women can get away with anything in a casino, because the casinos are chauvinistic and they don't believe that women can do math. So, you know, I remember one of the people I interviewed was this attractive blonde. Her whole thing was she would wear like a tennis outfit, and she would even carry a tennis racket, and she would sit in the casino and be like, oh, my boyfriend's playing tennis, I'm so bored, I'm just going to bet $10,000. And the reality was she's an applied math economics major at MIT, but the assumption is she's this ditzy blonde who doesn't know what she's doing. It also turns out when there's a girl in the casino with a low-cut top, all of those security cameras are actually focused on her. And I had an opportunity, I was in the Venetian security room, and all of the cameras were on, all those TV screens, and there's this woman walking through the casino, and I'm like, oh, wow, is she about to rob the place? And the security guys are like, no, we're just bored. So, you know, the MIT team would recruit as many women as they could. If you knew these guys, that was a whole lot harder than recruiting Asians and Persians for them. Eventually, they were hiring girls. They would hire strippers from the strip clubs and just place her at the end of the table so that the cameras would be on the stripper, and then they would do their bets. You'd also try and play when there were celebrities in town, because if you're sitting with like Michael Jordan, no one's looking at you. And Michael Jordan could be betting 1/10 of what you're betting, but nobody's paying attention to you. And in this way, they would play, and they won, you know, as I said, between $5 and $7 million. The biggest problem for them became the money itself. Although it's not illegal to fly through Logan Airport with $1 million in cash in a duffel bag, it looks really bad. You know, what happens to you, and I won't say how I know this, but I do know this, you end up in a cell beneath Logan Airport, and you end up handcuffed to a chair, and the DEA comes in, and the IRS comes in, and they take your money away, and you have to spend about 6 months trying to get your money back. And so it's a real pain in the ass. So eventually what they did is they would keep the money in safety deposit boxes. They also used chips, because it turns out the airports are not smart enough yet to realize that chips are money. So they would fly around with $1 million in Bellagio chips, and they would just say, oh, I'm just going to a poker game. And no one would ever suspect it. The other thing was at MIT, they started to keep their money on campus. This is a cool little story, but a bunch of the team members found this old safe that was used in World War I to use the payrolls at MIT. And it was in one of the building's basements. And so they cracked the safe, and they would keep all of the money on campus. So every Friday, they'd go to this safe and make a withdrawal, and they'd fly to Vegas, and on Monday, they'd come back, and they'd actually put the money back in the safe. And after the MIT team got busted and couldn't play anymore, one of them wanted to take the safe as kind of a memento. So they got a big flatbed truck, and they drove it into MIT. They managed to hoist the safe onto the truck where it broke the axle of the truck. They had to get a second truck, and they brought it to a house in Brookline where it's now sunk about a foot into the cement basement of the house. I remember the dean of MIT wanted me to return the safe, and I wouldn't tell them where it is. So to this day, they don't know where the safe is, but it's still in Brookline. And so eventually, the money became an issue, and eventually the team did break up. It got cracked by a private eye. The way the private eyes eventually caught it is they followed one of the big players who kept winning and kept winning. They followed him back to Boston and realized he had gone to MIT. So they basically went into the administration buildings at MIT. They got a hold of every yearbook for a 10-year period. And they pulled all the pictures out, and they put it into that software they run, the facial recognition software. So if you had gone to MIT in a 10-year period and walked into a Vegas casino, you would come up on a screen. And so some of you might have been during this process, but Eventually, they cracked the team. And what happened is it wasn't right away a hard bar, it's called. What happens at first is you're sitting at the table, you're playing, and this very big guy comes up behind you, and they stand right in your space because the security there has been taught to get inside your space. Because you're not actually doing anything illegal when you're card counting. But if you push a security card, you have done something illegal. So the security guard gets in your face and he says, you can't play here anymore. And so what you do is you just get up and you leave. Usually you run out of there. The next thing they try and do is bring you to the back room. And again, I'm not going to go into how I know about the back room, but I do know about the back room. You end up in the back room. They stand you up against a wall. They photograph you. There'll be a guy in the hallway talking about how you roughed up a guard and you're going to go to jail. Eventually, they make you sign a piece of paper that's called the Trespass Act, which means that if you ever return to their casino, you're trespassing. No one's ever been arrested for trespassing in a casino, as far as I know, but they make you sign it, and it pretty much scares you off. And that's when you leave and you start moving to other casinos. Eventually, the team started playing all over the country. A few of them went across the world to places like Monte Carlo, but that's where it gets very dangerous because those casinos are still all mob run. It's all Russian mob. And there's a scene in my book, Busting Vegas, which is kind of a sequel or a prequel to Bring It On the House, where one of the kids actually brings a team to Monte Carlo. They get caught and they were brought out into the woods, essentially, lined up along the side of a road, and a policeman with a gun walked behind them and told them they were never to return to Monte Carlo, and of course they never returned to Monte Carlo. But you know, that was that scene. And what happened was I had written an article about this team. It was right before my book came out, and I'm sitting at home and I get a phone call and it's Kevin Spacey. And I thought Kevin Spacey's a great actor. I actually didn't believe it was Kevin Spacey. I remember hanging up on him and calling my mom and saying, Kevin Spacey's trying to call me. And he's like, she's like, no, it's MIT kids prank calling you. But it really was Kevin Spacey. And I called him back and I went out to Hollywood and he said, we want to make a movie of it. And I said, okay, go for it. And they sent it out and every studio rejected it except for MGM, which coincidentally was the casinos that we had been hitting for the past year. So at first we thought, is MGM buying this to make a movie or are they buying it to get rid of it? But it turns out they wanted to make a movie because Vegas loves Bringing Down the House. They love this book because everyone reads it on the flight to Vegas. And I always feel bad when I see people reading it there, and that's the worst time to read that book. Because you land and you think, I'm going to beat blackjack. The reality is you have to practice 3 to 6 hours a day for months before you're allowed to join the MIT team. They would practice in fake casino settings, you know, with girls dressed as cocktail waitresses, and they would get drunk and then still be able to count cards. These guys were so good that they would take a scotch glass, put it on the end of the table, and they would count in the reflection on the glass. So they never even were looking at the cards. And to get that good takes a lot of practice, and it turns out if you make one mistake an hour, it's worse than not card counting at all, because you end up betting too much at the wrong times. So if the casino realizes you're a card counter, nowadays what they do is they watch you, and they've employed card counters as well. If they watch you, and if they determine that you're not very good, they comp you a room, you know, they send more drinks over, they're like, keep on playing. So anyways, it was about a week before our 21 premiere, and I got an email. A random email came into my house. And I always get random emails because after Bringing Down the House, every kid who did something wild pretty much emails me or calls me. And I got an email, and it was a strange little email. It was from a Harvard senior, and he said, my best friend co-founded Facebook, and no one's ever heard of him. Now, I knew what Facebook was. My wife had actually gotten me on Facebook. I thought it was fun. You know, you got to see the parties that you weren't invited to. You know, I had friends who'd been dumped by their girlfriends because of putting bad pictures up on Facebook. So I knew what it was. At the time, it was like 150 million members, which was pretty big. And it was on its way towards 500 million members, which made it the third largest country in the world, if you looked at it that way. I thought it was cool, but I knew nothing about it other than Mark Zuckerberg. So I go out for a drink with this guy, and in walks Eduardo Saverin. And he was angry. Eduardo was really, a little drunk too, but really angry. And he starts to tell me how Mark Zuckerberg had screwed him out of Facebook. And his story was amazing, and a lot of you probably saw The Social Network, but I had never heard any of this before. He basically tells me that him and Mark were these geeky, you know, losers. They were best friends at Harvard. They couldn't meet girls. Eduardo wanted to be a member of a finals club, which are these semi-secret societies at Harvard. They're kind of like the Skull and Bones at Yale. And Mark had no chance of getting in. Late one night after a really bad date, Mark hacked into all the computers at Harvard, pulled up pictures of every girl on campus, and made a website where you could vote on who the hottest girl at Harvard was. He leaks it out to a couple friends. It spreads all over campus. By the end of the night, 20,000 people try and log on at the same time. It crashed Harvard servers, and Mark almost got kicked out of school. He caught the attention of the Winklevi. You couldn't have invented these guys if you wanted to, right? 6'5" Olympic rowers, identical twins. I remember meeting them for the first time in a hotel in New York, and in they walk, and they look like robots, and they finish each other's sentences. And I think it was Tyler, or it might have been Cameron, I don't know which one. One of them was like, you look at us and you assume immediately we're the bad guys. If this were an 80s movie, we'd be, in skeleton costumes chasing the Karate Kid around the dance. And I ended up putting that line in the book, which Aaron Sorkin then put it in the movie. And the first call I got was actually from the real Karate Kid, Ralph Macchio, who loved that we put a Karate Kid reference in the movie. But he's making a comeback now in Dancing with the Stars, so he doesn't need us anymore. But the Winklevi were essentially not the bad guys in their point of view. In their point of view, Mark Zuckerberg got famous because of that face mash, that website hack. They needed a geek because they were working on their own website. I think at the time it was called the Harvard Connection. And it was basically a dating website for Harvard men. It was a way to help Harvard men meet girls. Harvard men spent a lot of time thinking about ways to help girls meet them. So that was their idea, and they hired Mark as their nerd. Mark wanted to hang out with the cool kids on campus. These guys were the jocks. They were members of the most elite finals club. Mark had no interest in their idea. He thought it was stupid. It was a dating site. It had a few interesting components to it. One of them was that you needed a Harvard EDU to join, and that made it exclusive. But Mark otherwise didn't think much of their idea. Instead, he went up to his friend Eduardo and said, I have an idea for a website. If you put up $1,000, you can have 30% of the company and be our CFO. Eduardo thought, hey, that's a great idea. What's the website? And Mark said, it's going to be called Facebook, essentially. It's where people can put their own pictures up, put their own stuff up, and it'll be really cool. And that was really the basis of it. Mark sat down. He spent about 2 weeks making this site. He worked incredibly hard, and he built Facebook. He launched it. Within a couple of weeks, everyone at Harvard had joined on. Everyone kind of knows the story. A few months later, there were 1 million members. Things went crazy very fast. Mark meets up with this kid, Sean Parker. Sean was, the internet rock star. He was the kid who co-founded Napster, and then that, of course, crashed and burned. Then he co-founded Plaxo. He got kicked out of it after getting caught with cocaine, supposedly. And so he was basically looking for his next billion-dollar idea. Mark thought he was awesome, he was cool, he was fashionable, he was social. Eduardo didn't like him at all. Sean didn't like Eduardo. And basically, Mark moved off to California to work with Sean and build Facebook. Eduardo stayed behind to finish college, went to New York, and he starts to realize he's getting pushed out of the company, and he does something pretty stupid. He freezes the company's bank accounts. This pisses off Mark. Mark goes to Sean. Sean brings them to Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel invests $500,000 to keep Facebook going. But part of the way he invested it was said, we got to get rid of this guy, Eduardo. And so essentially, they invite Eduardo out to California. Eduardo claims that he's sandbagged, that he walks into a room full of lawyers. He thinks they're his lawyers. They're actually Mark's lawyers because they're Facebook's lawyers. They have him sign a document which essentially dilutes his shares to almost zero. It doesn't dilute anybody else. Eduardo realizes what happens, and then he sues. The Winklevi, meanwhile, sue. Everyone sues. And Mark is essentially the head of Facebook. And that was the story. The last piece of the story, of course, is Sean Parker getting caught at a party with cocaine again. He's the CEO of Facebook at the time, so it looks bad, so he has to leave Facebook very quickly, although he takes about 5% of the company with him. That's where it ends. That's when Eduardo comes to me. Eduardo's in the midst of this huge lawsuit, so he's not supposed to be talking to anybody. He's very angry. I write up a 10-page book proposal. I think it was 14 pages. I don't mean to send it anywhere, but it ends up getting leaked out onto the internet. This is almost like the story itself. It lands on a website called Gawker.com, and then a whole bunch of things happen at once. First of all, Eduardo freaks out because he's not supposed to be talking to anybody. He's in the midst of a massive lawsuit. He cuts off all contact with me and sends a restraining order saying I can never speak to him again. Mark Zuckerberg freaks out. He knows that I'm talking to Eduardo. He knows I'm writing this story. Facebook starts calling me all the time. I spent about a year trying to talk to Mark. I wanted to hear his side of the story. I went to them again and again and again and again. They were very nice, but they kept saying no because they couldn't control what I would write. And this, frankly, wasn't the story Mark wanted to tell. He never wanted to mention Eduardo. Eduardo had been cut out of Facebook for 5 years. No one had heard of the guy, and I was bringing him back in. Another thing happened at the same time was that Aaron Sorkin read the proposal on the web and called me up and said, I want to make this my next movie. Well, that's, awesome. I was like, great, go ahead. He gives it to David Fincher. David Fincher says, I want to direct it, but only if we do it right now. Because the reality is, who knows if Facebook will be around in 2 years when it normally takes that long for a movie to come out. So everything gets greenlit automatically and the movie gets made very quickly. Everything kind of goes crazy from there. Eduardo I have not spoken to since. My understanding is that he received 5% of Facebook in a settlement, which is now roughly $4 to $5 billion. So he should really send me a gift basket, honestly. He's now reinstated as co-founder of Facebook, but he has no involvement. He's run off. He lives in Singapore now. If you read the book or saw the movie, you know that he loves Asian women. So Singapore was where he wanted to end up. Sean Parker had to leave after the cocaine incident, and so he received between 5 and 7% of Facebook. So again, another few $1 billion. The Winklevi sued and settled for $65 million. They re-sued, claiming that wasn't enough. That just got thrown out of court. They're attempting to re-sue again, and it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. The Winklevi will not give up. They're training for the Olympics right now. They're going to row again in London. But that's where they stand right now. And I guess that's the end of the story. Other than me, I've been called the Jackie Collins of Silicon Valley by Mark. My career has continued in that direction. And I guess I'll end with just a teaser of my next book, because you're actually getting me 2 weeks before it comes out, so I'm about to launch the tour. The book is called Sex on the Moon, and it's a true story about a kid, brilliant kid who is from Utah, who basically got into NASA's astronaut training program. He was a genius. He was in a co-op program there on his way to becoming an astronaut. He fell in love with a 19-year-old girl, so to impress her, he broke into a lab and stole a 600-pound safe of moon rocks from every moon landing in history. So there was a piece from every Apollo project. He gets out of NASA with this safe full of moon rocks. He spreads them on a bed and has sex with his girlfriend on the moon, and then attempts to sell them to a gem dealer he meets on the internet. The guy turns out to be an FBI plant. It's a massive FBI sting operation, helicopters, 100 agents. The kid gets arrested and goes to jail for 7.5 years for what to him was kind of a college prank. And the day he got out of prison, he called me and said he wants me to write a story. So Sex on the Moon will be out in about 2 weeks, and it's a wild story. And I thought, I know you're running to a cocktail party, but if anybody had any questions, I think there are mics. I'm up for any kind of questions about anything I've written, but I hope you enjoyed my movie so far, and I'll keep on bringing them to you. Thank you. Does anybody, I don't know where the mics are, but if someone wants to let somebody...
Is it on?
Oh.
I have a question.
Sure.
There's a book called The Eudaimonic Pie about the guys that did the roulette wheel and were able to get like 2 to 4% on it.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's a really cool story. There's this group of guys who basically cracked roulette. It turns out that they had a system basically analyzing the same way you'd analyze a satellite going around the Earth's orbit. And it gave them a slight advantage, and they ended up making an amount of money off of it. I actually ran to another group that was beating roulette, and this group was about 40 guys. And what they had done was they realized that some of the older roulette wheels in Vegas have a tilt to them. And it's a very slight tilt. But they would send guys out to every roulette wheel in Vegas, and they'd sit there all day long and marking where it was dropped and marking where it landed. And they would figure out which wheels were slightly bent. Then they would go in, they'd hit that wheel until Vegas realized that wheel was broken and the wheel would be taken away. And they had made a couple $1 million doing this. So it's a cool scheme. I love the Eudaimonic Pie. Great, great book. Yeah, I haven't really written about any other kind of Vegas scheme yet. But there are a bunch of them. I know a bunch of guys who were beating, there was a game in Foxwoods called Pirate's Booty. Some genius at Foxwoods came up with this game, and it only had 2 tables. And an MIT team realized that it was beatable, and they played it for 48 straight hours, won $600,000, and then the tables were taken away, and the guy who came up with it was fired. So that was a cool story, too. But there are always these schemes that tend to work, and it's cool to research them. But yeah. Anything? Anybody? Well, after Sex on the Moon, I mean, I'm about to tour. We're actually going to make a movie of Sex on the Moon. And the same producers who did The Social Network have gotten together to make it. I believe the guy who directed Easy A is attached, from what I understand. So that'll be really cool, and that's next. After that, I don't know what the next project is. I pretty much am getting, I have a phone that I call the crazy phone, which is like a listed phone number. And now Twitter, people are tweeting me ideas all day long, and I don't know what's next. I go through them and kind of research them a little bit and then decide whether they're worthwhile or not. But I don't know what's after Sex on the Moon, but this summer, that's all. I love saying that title over and over again, Sex on the Moon. You can't beat that.
So, Ben, I've got a question for
Sure.
you. What point does your job get dangerous? I mean, there's a lot of people that are pissed with you.
You know, it's funny. I'm this incredibly neurotic person, if anybody knows me. I'm like Hunter S. Thompson meets Woody Allen, in that I wouldn't be Hunter S. Thompson because I'm terrified of the guns and the drugs and the alcohol. So I kind of try in my regular life to be very safe, but when I go into these stories, I do get into some dangerous situations. I wrote a book called Ugly Americans, some of you might have read. It takes place in Japan. It's about a guy from Jersey who ends up in Tokyo. He'd never been out of Jersey. He was a football player at Princeton. He had like a mullet. He gets a call out of the blue. He can't go pro because he's too small. So an alum from Princeton calls him and invites him to Japan to come work for him. Turns out the guy is Nick Leeson, who he ends up working for. Some of you may remember Nick Leeson was the 26-year-old trader who bankrupted the biggest bank in England, Barron's, by betting all of the assets on the bank right before an earthquake. This guy that I wrote about ends up becoming this high roller in Japan, part of the whole expat scene, falls in love with a daughter of a Yakuza gangster that he meets in a hostess club, and then makes $500 million in 5 minutes and has to get out of the country very quickly. So to research it, I went to Japan for about a month, and I ended up interviewing a lot of Yakuza gangsters. And I remember one night I was in Osaka, and some liaison had set me up, and he said, you're going to go into this bar, and there's going to be a gangster in front of you, and behind you there will be a table of men. You are not to look at them. If you turn around and look at them, something bad will happen to you. So I literally go into this bar and I do a whole interview like this, and I never turned around. I don't even know what I asked this guy. I basically ran out of there and took off. But you end up in situations like that. I remember in Vegas Bringing Down the House, the private eye who had cracked the team said, oh, I'm going to meet with you. And he gives me this address. It's like in the middle of the desert. And so I go to the middle of the desert, and this pickup truck pulls up, and there's a dude with a gun, and he's like, get in. and he was just trying to scare me a little bit. And I get in, and we go to his office, and he's got a computer on, and he points to his computer, and on it is like a satellite picture of my house, of where I live. And so I was like, okay, it's a little scary. but in the end, I usually turn back at the moment where I feel like it's actually dangerous. The people I write about are, for the most part, really smart, good people. I mean, meeting this new kid who had spent 7.5 years in a federal prison, it's a little scary because he's been in jail a long time. And I met him the first time in a crowded lobby of a hotel. But he was a really nice, sweet guy who just had done a lot of time in prison. All the prisoners called him Moon Rocks. That was his name in prison. Yeah, you always have to just realize when you're getting a little bit too dangerous and kind of back off at that point. But yeah, every now and then it gets there. Huh? Anybody?
Do we have other questions? Well, just whilst you're thinking about them, I have one more.
Okay.
The Social Network obviously was a fabulous movie, and this may be a bit of a dumb question, but the thing that struck me when I came out of the movie theatre was where does MySpace fit into all of that?
MySpace. Well, MySpace was around before Facebook. MySpace, blew it. That would be my answer to that question. I don't know if anybody here was involved with MySpace in any way, but it's like trashy, chaotic. It's like Facebook is classy in so many ways compared to MySpace. MySpace is this dirty free-for-all where it's half-naked women and bands basically takes over MySpace. Originally, MySpace was really cool, and everyone was on MySpace. And MySpace built to a couple 100 million people, and it was incredibly valued, and it could have been Facebook, but I feel like they made a lot of mistakes, and it was all about the user experience. The MySpace user experience was awful, and the Facebook user experience was fantastic. And MySpace was aimed at kids, really, high school, college kids, and bands. And Facebook was aimed at everyone. Mark didn't set out. He set out initially it was college, it was Harvard, then it was Ivy League, then it was colleges, then it was high schools, and then it was the world. But when it became the world, it was all about the user experience. It would always be simple. It would never break down. It wasn't people designing their own page like MySpace was. And it was all about the user. And I think, to his credit, Mark was a genius in that respect. And I think MySpace blew it. I don't think MySpace realized what they had. But they were around first. And everyone's always like, did Mark steal the idea from the Winklevi? Well, the reality is he stole it from Friendster, right? I mean, Friendster was Facebook, but then Friendster just fell apart. It always broke down, it couldn't handle it, and they weren't focused enough on building it into what Facebook became. So I think Facebook was brilliant in how they built themselves, and MySpace just blew it. That's my opinion. But yeah.
Cool.
Well, anyways, listen, I want to thank you all so much. I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy Boston if you're not from here. Thank you.